So in our last class, we stopped at the point where we mentioned that the 20th century marks the beginning of the modern world. Although we've studied the precursors of the modern world in the previous ages, beginning from the 16th century. We also said that the 20th century literature is the literature of the modern world. And we went on to list some of the authors and the works usually considered to be extant authors and texts of the modern world. So today we'll move on from there to talk about the characteristics of modernist literature, or what should constitute the characteristics of modern world literature, one world novel. And in doing that, we'll try to contrast those characteristics with the ones we had in the previous ages. Remember that when we talk about the modern world, we're usually talking about breaks and ruptures, discontinuities with previous traditions. In fact, these breaks were radical and transformative in many ways, whether it's in the area of ideology or in literary practices. So compared to the novels written in the previous ages, the novel in the first half of the 20th century, the novel in the first half of the 20th century changed in terms of technique, point of view, the relationship between the author and the audience, and change in subject matter. If you want to discuss the changes that occurred in the novel of the modern world that set that novel apart from the novel of the previous ages, then you must take note of these points. There was change in technique, change in point of view, change in the relationship between the author and the audience, and change in subject matter. Change in terms of technique, point of view, the relationship between the author and the audience and the reader, and change in subject matter. In the most significant novelist of the modern period, the most significant novelists of the modern period, there took place either implicitly or explicitly. There took place either implicitly or explicitly a radical redefinition of the nature and function of fiction. There took place a radical redefinition of the nature and function of fiction. The English novel, from its beginnings in the late 17th century and early 18th century, the English novel, from its beginnings in the late 17th century, but then we are talking about a novel of sensibilities like Pamela by Richardson, and early 18th century. By this time you're talking about Robinson Crusoe by Defoe. So the English novel, from its beginnings in the late 17th century and early 18th century to its great popular flowering in the 19th century, the English novel bloomed and blossomed in the 19th century with writers like Jane Austen. So that's what we're saying. To its great popular flowering, like from flower, flowering, okay, in the 19th century. With writers like Jane Austen had been essentially what might be called a public instrument. It was used to express what was of public interest. Essentially what might be called a public instrument. The English novel, from its beginnings in the late 17th century and early 18th century to its great flowering in the 19th century, had been essentially what might be called a public instrument, meaning that it was used to capture what was of public interest. The novel then based its view the novel then based its view of what was significant in human affairs on a generally agreed standards. The novel then based its view of what was significant in human affairs on a generally agreed standards. So what we are trying to say here is that before the modern world, novelists used the art to express what was popular public concerns. The novel had a public outlook. In other words, the plot of the novel was constructed out of incidents and situations which were seen to matter in human affairs.
Agreed upon by the writer and the reader.
The plot of the novel before
The
20th century was constructed out of incidents and situations which were seen to matter in human affairs, equally agreed to by both the writer and the reader. The novel took into consideration, prior to the 20th century, changes in economic or social position of the individual. The novel took into consideration changes in the social or economic position of the individual, as well as changes in even marital situation. As indices that could affect the individual's character. And his position in society. To put it in a simpler way, a change in the economic situation of the individual was a change in the individual's signals, a change in the individual's character, and at the same time signals a change in individual position in society. This is what you see in the 19th century novel. An alteration in the individual's economic circumstances is an indication of an alteration in the individual's character, and at the same time a change in the individual's positionality in society. Take, for instance, marriage. Marriage could lead to a better social position. That if the individual changes his or her status from single to married, then it could change the individual's position in society. It could affect. Okay? If the individual comes into wealth, it could change the individual's position in society, can subsequently affect the individual's character. Same if the individual loses wealth. At this time too, the author's attitude to his characters was essentially one of observer. The author did not have agency, but only observes and reports. The author does not have agency, but he only observes and reports. The author's attitude to his characters was essentially one of observer. This means that anything significant in his character's behavior was at once indicated by a publicly observable movement towards some shift in status or fortune. Any significant anything significant in his character's behavior was at once indicated by a publicly observable movement towards a shift in status or fortune. We can then sum by saying that in the 19th century novel, down the ages, character was fate. Character was fate. Anything significant in his character's behavior was at once indicated by a publicly observable movement towards some shift in status or fortune. The character of the individual usually equals his fate, his position in society. Prior to the 20th century, the English novel aimed mostly to depict the English middle class. The English novel aimed mostly to depict the English middle class. And the middle class was known to be conscious of their social and economic position. And the middle class was known to be conscious of their social and economic positions. They were also concerned with the relationship between public esteem and real worth. They were also concerned with the relationship between public esteem and real worth. That is how the individual is perceived by society and who the individual really is. They were also concerned with the relation between public esteem and real worth. And real worth. And real worth. So the major conflicts in the 19th century novel, was how the individual could achieve his or her goals and dreams without losing his place in society. Which is a very serious conflict, because the individual has desires and goals, and sometimes these desires and goals are in direct contradiction to societal expectation. So, how can an individual go about achieving his desires and goals without earning the wrath of society?
without earning the wrath of society.
without being condemned by society. That was the major conflict of the 19th century novel. Because the individual had societal standards to obey, even in the course of trying to achieve personal desires and goals, whether in marriage or in wealth or in occupation and so on and so forth. There were rules for the individual to follow. So these conflicts are well dramatized in most of Jane Austen's novels. These conflicts are well dramatized in most of Jane Austen's novels.
Say Pride and Prejudice.
Say Emma, and so on and so forth. Say Pride and Prejudice, say Emma, and so on and so forth.
Right?
In a modern novel, the novelist may have no assurance. In the modern novel, so when you see Pride and Prejudice, you read it as a 19th century novel and look at the conflicts that operate in it. And when you see Emma, as you also read, that's if you've not already read, because I know that you guys are great students and you must have read most of these novels, right? So it's only for those who have not read, you know. So in the modern novel, the novelist may have no assurance that it is the outward action which reveals a significant fact about his character. In the modern novel, the novelist may have no assurance that it is the outward action which reveals the significant fact about his character. Nor is he convinced that the public gestures provided by society, nor is he convinced that the public gestures provided by society can ever achieve real communication between individuals. So that is where the break occurs between the 19th century novel down and the modern novel. That's where you have the disruption. Can ever achieve real communication between individuals. Okay, so I'll take that statement again. In the modern novel, the novelist may have no assurance that it is the outward action which reveals the significant fact about his character. That's the novelist's character. Okay? Nor is he convinced that the public gestures provided by society can ever achieve real communication between individuals. And I said that is where the break occurs between the 19th century novel down and the 20th century. Because the 20th century novel goes inside, all right, the character. Does not care about the outward actions, but looks at the inward motive of the character. That's where things begin to get interesting, right? In the novelistic genre. the novel becomes more individualistic and less of a public instrument in the 20th century. The novel becomes more introspective, more psychological, and less outward. Okay? So that whatever outward action one sees, one should understand that the basis for the action is psychological, is inside. Okay? So the modern novelist is born when that publicly shared principle of selection is no longer felt to exist. The modern novelist is born when that publicly shared principle of selection is no longer felt to exist. And can no longer be depended upon. Because the novel has become more individualistic, more concerned with the individual's struggles in life, than the individual's public concerns or of societal expectations or what is expected by society of the individual. Like most modernist literature, the modern novel is marked by experimentation in techniques. Like most modernist literature, the modern novel is marked by what? Experimentation in techniques. Experimentation in techniques. Trying out new ways of telling the human story. Shedding previous novelistic traditions. Discarding previous novelistic traditions. Being innovative, creative, and imaginative in narrative techniques, finding out new ways to share the human story. That's what we mean by experimentation in techniques. One of such experimentation is the act of bring the technique of poetry into prose fiction. Bring the technique of poetry into prose fiction. Like writing prose fiction as if it were poetry. Making prose poetic. Right? That's one of the experimentation. The poeticization of prose is a major experimentation of technique in the modernist novel, in the novel of the 20th century. So you read a novel and it sounds like poetry. It's poetic. The novel is poetic, right? So you can write this. The heroic age of experimentation. The heroic age of experimentation and expansion. The heroic age of experimentation and expansion in the English novel has the product of what might be called a crisis in civilization. Was informed by what might be called a crisis in civilization. The heroic age of experimentation and expansion in the English novel has the product of what might be called a crisis in civilization. Comma, and not necessarily a willful desire to make it new, and be original for the sake of being original, and not necessarily based on a willful desire to make it new or be original for the sake of being original. If you have been exposed to some of the tenets of modernist literature, you would have come across the term make it new, right? Make it new. Which is accredited to Ezra Pound. Now, the idea of making it new resonates with modernist literature because of experimentation in form and technique. But in the novel, the idea of experimentation was more informed by a crisis of civilization rather than the need to be original. That's the statement that we are trying to make. The modernist novel was influenced, the modernist novel and its techniques was influenced by the new conception of time. By the new conception of time. At this point, time was conceived as a continuous flow. Continuous flow. A continuous flow. In sharp contrast to how it was perceived in the previous era. Before now, time was conceived as a series of separate points. A series of separate points. But in the 20th century, time is seen as a continuous flow, never stopping. And the novel has to build that time consciousness into its narrative pattern, into its narrative technique. And this is why we have in the modern novel what we call continuity of consciousness. No breaks, but continuity of consciousness. That's why we have in the modern novel what we call continuity of consciousness. So the human consciousness is in a continuous state of flow. So this new view of time is accredited to Henry Bergson. And the view of consciousness in a modern novel as perceived by most writers is based on the works of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. It should be noted that in the 20th century, the novel became more psychological. It should be noted that in the 20th century, the novel became more psychological. This was as a response to the works of psychoanalysts like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. So this led to the idea of the multiplicity of consciousness. The multiplicity of consciousness. Of course, you are aware of the partitioning of the human mind into the conscious and the unconscious, with both constantly affecting each other. In a modern novel, we see this in terms of how all human actions are psychologically motivated. All human actions are psychologically motivated. So the novelist attempted to go inside the mind of the character to narrate the story from there, so as to let us see the psychological motivation of human action. Let us be aware of how the individual is at the mercy of his mental constitution and nothing more, nothing less. So in the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious, and added to the conception of time as a continuous flow, the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious, and added to the view of time as a continuous flow, it is perceived in the modern novel, modern novel, that the past exists always in the present. That the past exists always in the present. And that it continually influences or determines the nature of our present responses. The past always exists in the present and constantly determines the nature of our present responses. Because the unconscious is always active. It might be there, latent, unknown to the conscious, but it's always determining how the individual acts or behaves. And so when you add that to the concept of time as a continuous flow, then it becomes quite interesting, because then our present actions are always being informed by what happened in the past. And so the character of the modern novel becomes quite interesting to study, to look at, to observe. Another aspect of characterization in the modern novel and indeed its theme, that aspect of characterization, the modern novel, and indeed its theme is loneliness. Loneliness. The hero in the modern novel is usually portrayed as lonely. And of course, loneliness is a major theme of the modern novel. So loneliness is seen as a necessary condition of man in the modern norm. Loneliness is a necessary condition of man in the modern norm. This loneliness is occasioned not only by social isolation owing to the nature of society, as a society that has lost its communality. This loneliness is occasioned not only by social isolation occasioned by the nature of society. By that I mean a society that has lost its communality, right? It is also occasioned by the individual psychological constitution. It's also occasioned by individuals' psychological constitution, marked by certain social dilemmas. Marked by certain social dilemmas. Marked by certain social dilemmas. You see, the modern man, the modern character is individualistic. The modern character is individualistic. Wants to do things that please himself. After all, there are really no more societal expectations. Even if there were, he doesn't care. But then, he also wants to communicate. He's individualistic, wants to be alone, but at the same time also wants to communicate. Which is a kind of conflict, or where we have the balance, right? He wants to communicate but cannot escape from loneliness. He wants to be lonely but wants to communicate. That is the dilemma of the modern character, the modern man. Okay? So you note these issues when you pick up a modern novel and you read, and you see these issues coming up. So the character of the hero in the modern novel is isolated, lonely, but in need of companionship, in need of communication. Okay? Prefers to be alone, prefers to be isolated, but at the same time wants companionship, wants to communicate. And that creates conflict. In this loneliness, it must be stated that the isolation is usually psychological. The isolation is usually psychological. Because the individual can be in the midst of people and still is lonely. The character can be in the midst of people, in the midst of individuals, can go to the bar full of people and yet still alone. There is a neighbor next door, but there's no will to go across and say, So it's psychological. The will is not there. The modern novel is really devoted to the depiction and exploration of secret society. By that we mean society within society, world within world, society within society, and world within world. Okay? Because in this world there are many worlds. Yes. And in this society there are many societies. You get it? It's also devoted to the description of small communities. Small communities of people who share their experiences together as a way of finding meaning in a world of nothingness. In a world of nothingness, characterized by social pretension. Characterized by social pretension. You are likely to come across this in the novels of Ernest Hemingway. Novels of Hemingway. Okay. Ernest Hemingway. In the modern novel, can see the exploration of the ways in which social and political life are both necessary and at the same time corrupting. In the modern novel, we can see the exploration of the ways in which social and political life is at once necessary and corrupting. At once necessary and corrupting. You can find this in most of Conrad's novels. At once necessary and corrupting. You can find this in most of Conrad's novels. The modern novel is marked by solipsism. 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 The modern novel is marked by solipsism. One of its major themes is the theme of solipsism, which is the quality of being very self-centered or selfish. The quality of being very self-centered and selfish. The individual always wanting to have his way against the collective good. Okay, so self-preservation, though inherent in man's nature, is reinforced in the modern novel. All right? Self-preservation, though inherent in human nature, is reinforced, is heightened, elevated in the modern novel. That's what we mean by solipsism. Because the novel is individualistic. The modern novel makes use of stream of consciousness. The modern novel makes use of stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness. The stream of consciousness allows us to appreciate the psychological dimension of the modernist novel. The psychological imperative of the modernist novel. Stream of consciousness. The use of stream of consciousness allows us to appreciate the psychological dimension of the modernist novel. It is a narrative technique that affords the writer the ability to have access into the character's mind. A narrative technique that affords the writer the ability to have access into the character's mind and to narrate the story from there. And to narrate the story from there. So in the stream of consciousness, the writer does not have to tell the story by himself. He simply narrates the processes of the character's mind. He simply narrates the processes of the character's mind. Whatever comes out of the character's mind is what the writer tells us. All he has to do is to have access to the mind of the character. So in most of the modern novels, you come in contact with how characters think, because their thoughts are the substance of the story. And then even action can be used to infer. Action can be used to infer the individual's mental state. So for you to understand a particular character's action, you need to understand the psychological motivation of that action. So the modern novelist is born when outward action, societal standards are no longer prime motivators for the narration. But rather psychology, thoughts, and even the influence of the environment on the individual. Are prime motivations for actions, or motivators for action. Among the characteristics of the modern novel are 1. Realism. Among the characteristics of the modern novel are 1. Realism. The modern novel is realistic. The modern novel is realistic. The modern novel is realistic. Realism in the novel refers to a conscious attempt. Realism in the novel refers to a conscious attempt by the writer to depict life the way it is in the work of art. To depict life the way it is in the work of art.
Realism in the novel also infers. Realism in the novel also infers being faithful to reality. Being faithful to reality. A realistic novel is likely to be detailed, to contain a detailed account of events. A realistic novel is likely to contain a detailed account of events. A realistic novel is likely to be historical. A realistic novel is likely to be historical. It is likely to mention names that actually existed in the literary world. I like to mention names that actually existed in the extra-literary world. And it's likely to make references to events that actually happened in the extra-literary world. So, going by this, we can safely say that one of the major characteristics of the 20th century novel is realism. The faithful depiction of life as it is in the literary work. So, as you will notice, most of the novels that we study on the course are novels that respond to actual events in the real world. Whether it is colonialism, whether it is plague, whether it is the war, whether it's a political event. Modern novel is historical, it's realistic, and so on and so forth. The modern novel illuminates all aspects of human reality and experience. The modern novel illuminates all aspects of human reality and experience. The modern novel illuminates all aspects of human reality and experience. The modern novel is detached and objective. The modern novel is detached and objective. That means there is a tendency for the author to distance himself from the narration. By the author to distance himself from the narration, refuse giving judgment, refuse blame game, not the text side. The author refuses the text side. There's what we call artistic distance. We call artistic distance between the author and the work. The modern novel does not moralize. The modern novel does not moralize. It is not prescriptive of what is right or what is wrong. It's not prescriptive, does not prescribe what is right and what is wrong, but simply presents life as it is. But simply presents life as it is. It does not aim to answer any moral question in the yes or in the no, or with certainty. It does not aim to answer any moral question with a yes or no, or with any modicum of certainty. Perhaps it presents the action as it is and leaves the reader to judge. Perhaps it presents the action as it is and leaves the reader to judge, to be the judge. In a modern novel, there is always the conflict between capitalism and communism. In a modern novel, there is always the conflict between capitalism and communism. This is a conflict at the level of ideology. This is a conflict at the level of ideology. Remember that the modernist novel is highly ideological. All literature is ideological, but when it gets to the modern novel, there's always the clash of ideologies. And the two ideologies that are likely to clash in a modern novel are capitalism and communism. Should resources in a given society, should the means of production in a given society be controlled by private individuals and corporations, or should it be collectively owned by everyone in society? Which system works better? Which system works better? These are the questions raised when capitalism and communism are juxtaposed in any modern novel. Another level of conflict usually experienced in the modern novel is one between science and religion. It's one between science and religion. It's one between science and religion. It should be recalled that the modern world is driven by science and scientific innovation, discoveries, and so on and so forth. Whereas the previous world was one controlled by religion. The modern world is driven by innovation in ideas and technology, the use of machines, sophisticated machines, equipment. They believe in science and its principles and techniques. All of this which clash with the precepts of religion, like the existence of the supernatural. They believe in fate and afterlife. So these contradicting concepts usually clash in any modern novel. Okay? Another level of conflict usually expressed in the modern novel is the clash between the old and the new world. The world that is gone and the one that is emerging. The modern novel is caught between two worlds, the old and the new. This is why in the critique of the modern novel, we normally have what we call continuities and discontinuities. It explains why in the critique of the modern novel, or any modern literature, normally have what we call continuities and discontinuities. Discontinuity is marked by breaks, radical breaks, ruptures, and transformation. With whatever had gone before, whatever had been before. We are talking about a break with tradition, disruption and destabilization of cultural values, breaks in beliefs, and continuities, whatever one is able to carry over into the new world, whether it is of consciousness or material, or even value. Leave the class. So the modern novel has a pessimistic tone. The modern novel has a pessimistic tone. Of course, this tone agrees with the zeitgeist of the age. Of course, this tone agrees with the zeitgeist of the age. Zeitgeist of the age. The modernist novel has a pessimistic tone modern novel has a pessimistic tone. And I said that the tone agrees with the zeitgeist of the age, with the spirit of the age. Spirit of the age. So the modern novel could not help but be pessimistic in tone because of some necessary reason, like the laws of religious faith by the intervention of science, the uncertainty in life, the wars and bloodshed, the laws of community, loneliness in man's isolation and one another, owing to laws of community, individualism and self-preservation, as well as man's inhumanity to other men, And finally, the modern novel tends to condemn contemporary values and civilization, tends to show how it has failed. The modern novel tends to do what? To condemn, to criticize contemporary value and civilization, and to demonstrate how they are failed. The modern novel tends to condemn contemporary values and civilization, and to do what? To demonstrate how civilization has failed. Okay, so when we meet again, we move on to a specific interrogation of colonial texts. God bless you.